Practice does not always make perfect. No matter how long we spend painting, we might not actually be improving at all if we're not learning new concepts and using those concepts to change the way that we're actually thinking while we're drawing and painting. Thankfully, there's a really easy way to do that, especially if we're at home studying on our own, and that is through reading books. So today I have some of my favorite books from my own library, and I'm going to share with you why I think these are some of the best books and my favorite lessons from each one of these. Now, I'm primarily a landscape painter, so this selection might be a little bit biased, but I actually think that is a good thing for when you're learning how to paint, because when we're outside, we encounter so many different things that we need to understand and learn and really craft a holistic way to think about what it is that we're seeing and to be able to paint anything that we might encounter. So the first book I have is actually not a book on painting, but this is a book that revolutionized the way that I think about drawing and painting and improving at drawing and painting. And so it is called Peak by Anders Ericsson and Robert Poole. So the thing about Peak, it gave me the framework to understand that getting better at a skill is not just practice, but it is by acquiring and improving our mental models, our mental representations, the way we look and think about whatever it is that we're doing. A language is a mental representation when we are hearing all these syllables and all these noises, but we can make sense of that, and then we can translate that into thoughts and expression. When we're painting, this really helped me set up and understand that it's through developing mental models, mental representations, like looking at shapes, seeing the structure, learning about perspective, learning about different ways to think about color. It made me realize that I can keep improving on my own after I come out of the art academy by looking for new ways to think about what it is that I'm doing and seeing. There's a lot more I could say about this book, but I'll have to leave that for another day because I want to get to actual books on drawing and painting, and I don't want to bore you guys too soon. But the first book I'll choose is The Practice of Science and Drawing by Harold Speed. What's really special about this book is that he introduces this sense of what we need to first do to improve painting. When we are first starting to paint, we may overly rely on symbol drawing. And so this is a pretty good example of what symbol drawing might mean. When we are children, we often start out by drawing a portrait with a balloon-shaped head, triangle nose, little beady eyes, and spaghetti hair. But then when we start learning about some different skills, some different mental models to think about what it is that we're seeing, when we start thinking about just the shapes of color, the shapes of shadow and light, well, that is a new mental model to start interpreting what it is that we're seeing, and it opens up a whole new level of realism. And so Harold Speed identifies this as working on our sense of touch, because we are thinking a little bit too much about objects rather than using our sense of vision. Other things that Harold Speed's books is actually really phenomenal for, it goes into a whole lot, so like eye sockets, it goes into different brush marks, it goes on to blocking painting in from a drawing. One of the best parts about this book in terms of drawing is how he explains his understanding between line drawing and mass drawing. Line drawing for Harold Speed is what we would think about contour drawing. We would think about finding points, looking at angles, constructing things very visually, very optically. And mass drawing is a little bit more about working in terms of tone. So mass drawing relates a little bit more to painting in the way that we are working with our large masses, meaning our large shapes of tone, where we separate lights, shadows, midtones, and we work up from that. So the next book that I actually think is one of the best books on drawing specifically, and it's the book that had the most impact for me, is Solomon J. Solomon's The Practice of Oil Painting and Drawing. So this is a book that I really often like to cite just for its very first sentence. So the first sentence, as we could read, "Let me say at once that I thoroughly disapprove of what is understood by the blocking in of the whole figure or object that is commonly practiced." This might seem a little controversial. I'm sure many of you guys watching may have heard about the blocking in method, where you are roughly getting in these big masses. When I was at the academy, they had us draw these big lines, work out these really big shapes, and it was sort of like just a general average, and then we're supposed to work from the big into the small. But by the very first sentence of this book, we have something that is very contradicting. And Oftentimes in art education, you'll have two different teachers that are saying the exact opposite thing. And there are pros and cons to every single approach. There are pros to having this more massy, blobby oriented approach where you're sort of figuring the big things out. But there's really something to be said about being very, very specific and very, very accurate. The second thing that I really love about this book is how he breaks down drawing. So his first example in the first chapter really goes into being able to flatten the three-dimensional into the two-dimensional. It gives us this idea that everything that we see can simply be broken down into a plane of shapes, and then they can be carefully studied, measured, and replicated because of that. Here, he does a really great job of having plates about an example for drawing, and then going in and looking for what exact shapes and what exact relationships you need to look for. So point B, that is the space in between the nose and the contour. The second chapter is also one of my favorites. In the academy, we spent a whole lot of time working from the nude model, doing figure drawing. This, for me, really makes sense. In this chapter, he goes and breaks down and shows you exactly how he would go about drawing a figure, going from counting the heads to finding different points, finding vertical alignments, horizontal alignments, using measurements, finding triangles, finding tilts. It is one of the best books on painting. And then it continues to have some really phenomenal advice on drawing the figure, which I think this book just overall is worth its weight in gold when it comes to drawing. Because the thing is like, even if we're drawing a tree, a lot of the same skills are universal. So looking at positive and negative shapes, looking for contours, looking for alignments, using a plumb line, measuring things out. Solomon J. Solomon's approach of carefully drawing everything, for me, has made a lot of sense and is probably the best book on drawing I think there is. Now, for anyone interested in a little bit more on figure drawing, I think Vanderpoel's book, so this is John H. Vanderpoel, The Human Figure. This is a really fantastic book about drawing the human figure. It has a lot of really amazing diagrams about things to actually look for. So looking for the different form of the figure, learning about the trunk, learning about the skull, learning about the shapes of eyes, features like the mouth. When it comes to more realistic drawing, I think this book is really excellent for all the information that goes in. The Bridgman books are also really great, but I find that they can get misinterpreted a little bit as being a little bit too cartoony. The Bridgman books are great for knowing what to look for, but not drawing like that if you're a realist artist. I have one book here on drawing perspective, because perspective drawing is often a entirely different type of drawing. It's very constructive, working with shapes, cubes and spheres and cylinders. There is one book that I really think stands above the rest. This is Scott Robertson's How to Draw. And the reason why I think this book is so fantastic is because you can follow along all the steps in this book. And that's one thing I did many years ago. It has some simple exercises to make sure that you have some prerequisite freehand sketches. And then it goes about explaining exactly what perspective is, different things that we need to know about perspective. And then the really great thing about the rest of the book is it teaches you how to construct things, going from tilted angles to simple shapes, cylinders, and ellipses, all the way to being able to start drawing all these types of planes. And so this book is really amazing because it gives a great practical explanation of what perspective is, the things you need to know about perspective, and then it gives you a whole lot of practice of exercises where you can just follow along and learn to construct these things. And so when we're painting outside, if we see any complicated building or complicated object that we need to figure out how to draw, understanding how everything we see is a two-dimensional shape that we could carefully measure. But then on top of that, stack on this idea of construction, perspective, vanishing points. Combining both is a way that we really start to check what it is that we're drawing. I mean, you even get to learn how to do this. It's something that isn't necessary most of the time, but it's really, really helpful. And the fact that you can follow along, I think it's just great. It's one of my favorites. Next up, we've got a few big books on landscapes. And when I mean big books, these are books about big ideas. These books aren't actually that big themselves. So first off, I want to share with you guys a lesser known book on landscape painting, and that's Landscape Painting by Asher Durand and Birge Harrison. And the reason that I really like this book, it doesn't have all that many pictures. It has a few drawings by Asher Durand. Asher Durand, the first author of this book, he has a series of letters in this publication. And the second part of this book is a smaller book by Birge Harrison. Asher Durand was a Hudson River School landscape painter, and Birge Harrison was a tonalist landscape painter. These were two different art movements in America in the 19th century in landscape painting. Asher Durand, in his letters, they are letters that were published in a magazine as if they were free advice to a young artist that was looking to become a painter. And he talks about how you should go out, draw everything, start with the small features, start with rocks, start with twigs, move on to branches, move on with trees, carefully study everything in the landscape. Because we don't have a lot of examples of thought from the Romantic painters, Hudson River School are kind of a Romantic movement in the early 19th century. It's really fascinating for that reason. However, Birge Harrison's book offers us some much more practical advice that really stuck out to me. Several things from Birge Harrison's book. His explanation of refraction really blew my mind. Now, what refraction is how everything that we see is light, and that light gets absorbed by our own eyes, and our own eyes are actually imperfect. And so we see partly the way that light flows into other things is because that light is flowing within our own eye, and there are certain tells that we can see. So when we're looking at a really bright object, that actually filters off into the objects next to it, not because the light is actually doing that in the scene, but because that's something that's happening within our own eye. So understanding effects like that is very critical. He offers a really great palette, which is kind of the foundation of where my palette comes from, and he offers the idea that an ideal oil painting palette is a warm and a cool of each primary. I like to use a warm and a cool and an earth color of each primary. And there are a bunch of other really great things in this book, but the last chapter that really had a profound impact on me was a really small 3-page chapter called Temperament. When we are painting, when we're in a creative journey, there are often a lot of ups and downs. There are a lot of times where we might feel ecstatic, and there are a lot of times where we might feel burned out. And there was a particular period of time after my second year of the academy where I was really burned out, didn't want to paint at all, didn't want to draw, just kind of miserable with it. And reading this book from over 100 years ago, it was just fascinating to read how that's completely normal. And he even sort of switched the perspective. My son, you have temperament, to quote Birge Harrison, like rejoice, thank your lucky spirits. After this lull, the next creative high is going to be amazing. So a lot of really great things in the Birge Harrison book that makes it one of my favorites. But of course, I have to now refer to what a lot of people call the landscape painting Bible. And this is something that is commonly known for a lot of landscape painters. And if you haven't read this book yet, then you're in for a real treat. This book is Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, and there are a ton of really fantastic things that he teaches us from this book. And one of his most important theories when it comes to landscape painting is the theory of angle and consequent values. And so this little diagram down here is a little person, and this is the grass, this is a tree, these are hills, and this is the sky. What that means is usually when we go out and look at any landscape painting, we're going to have big masses of objects that we see. So the sky mass is going to be one big mass of color values that's going to get locked in on our painting. The upright trees, they're going to be usually grouped together as another one. Any flat plane grasses, that's going to be another plane. And any slanting hills, distant hills, that's going to be another big mass and a different plane. And the thing is, so you'll see here, typically what happens is the sky is the lightest because it is also a source of light, but then the plane that is flat, so we should say This plane that is flat is receiving the most amount of light from the sun, but also from the dome of the sky. So that is usually the next lightest mass in our landscape paintings. Any slanting hills that are on an average slanted are receiving more light, and the least light is from the upright planes. So typically what we see, sadly this book's in black and white, but we see this almost in every single landscape. If you go out and pick a bunch of grass and a bunch of green leaves off of a tree in the summer, you'll notice that it's almost the same green, it's almost the same chlorophyll. But standing from afar, looking out into the scene, looking through the effect of light and perspective, we see how the trees tend to be the darkest thing, the hills are a little bit lighter, the grasses are a little bit lighter than that, and obviously the sky is even lighter. The sky dome is a source of light in and of itself. A few other things I really love about this book that are really great. This kind of relates to refraction, but it also relates to diffraction. The idea when you have really small bit of dark against light or light against dark, well, then the light actually wraps around it and it makes this a little bit lighter or it makes this a little bit darker because the light doesn't manage to pull through it. So these little small optical effects are also really important. Refraction, diffraction, scattering, all that stuff, really critical. There are a bunch of other great things talking about the main line in composition, the zones of color in the sky, but there is one little story about composition that I particularly really like from Carlson's book, his idea about what makes a good composition. And so there are a lot of ideas about composition, and all these ideas are just different mental models of composition, different ideas what makes a good composition. And if we have these ideas in our mind about what makes a good composition, we're able to act on these ideas and make different and varying interesting compositions. And throughout different periods in art history, different artists have had different ideas about what makes a good composition, and then that reflects in that time period. John Carlson's idea about composition is really interesting. Landscape painting to him isn't necessarily something that's narrative, but oftentimes it's something that is decorative. So we have these different masses where we have the masses of hills and sky and trees and buildings and grass and path. If we tried to make our composition and make our painting about everything and anything, then we'll probably end up with a pretty uninteresting composition. But if we take something and decide what our painting is actually about, not a focal point, but a focal idea, I would say, then we can make a painting about the trees or about the hill or about the grass. And this starts allowing us to get really, really interesting arrangements in our paintings. And there's like 5-10 other things I could talk about this book, but I'll leave that there. If there's one book that you need to pick that you haven't read, this might be the one. Now, talking about other mental models and composition specifically, I have 2 books on composition that I think are really fantastic. Edgar Payne's Composition of Outdoor Painting. It was originally published, I believe, 1940 something. We can skip to the end. There are a whole lot of words in this book, but the crux, the real point of this book is his idea about compositional archetypes in landscape painting. So there are different archetypes, there are different common substructures that almost all landscape paintings fall on. You can have a steelyard composition where you have something really big balanced by something really small, balanced scales, 2 things evenly balanced by a point, a circular composition, an S-curve composition, a pyramid composition, a cross composition, and so on. There are a few other really interesting things: 3-spot, suspended steelyard, group mass. This book was once suggested to me that you just go ahead and memorize these different archetypes. And when you're outside painting, this will also take you a really, really long way. Now, when it comes to composition, we have a lot of different ideas about composition. I think there are actually some really good ideas about composition in the Harold Speed book, actually, and also in the Solomon J. Solomon, but they lack any diagrams, and there's just a chapter towards the end of the book, but various little truisms or heuristics. A rarer book on composition that I think is phenomenal is Composition by Cyril C. Pierce. Composition and Analysis of the Principles of Pictorial Design. I'm sadly missing a plate or 2, but it goes about in such defined detail on all these various ideas about composition: interchange, tone area, recession, rhythm, color, harmony, balance, line direction. I think is essentially important, and even goes into a little bit of notan. And our ideas of tone, the distribution of masses, making sure that you have an interesting arrangement within your painting just by the balance of masses of value. So your lightest value, your middle value, and your darkest value are all different, and they all create an interesting arrangement. Using gradation, using interchange, exercises with tone, finding interesting points. Line direction, I think, is something that's really interesting. And I forget how much of that I took from this book, but I'm often thinking when I compose about the direction of my lines in the painting and making sure I alternate things. So I don't have everything pointing off to the left or to the right, but I make sure that I have variety and balance and rhythm. Overall, the biggest thing about composition that is important to know is variety and balance. I think those are the two key principles to making interesting compositions that are not necessarily telling a story, but at least very interesting and aesthetically beautiful. And yeah, I probably should go on and reread this book because it's been a few years, but it is, I wish it was in publication, but it's not. You have to buy it used if you can find it. There are some PDFs out there though, I think. Now, I was second guessing whether or not I should put this book in the list. This is Landscape Painting by Sir Alfred East. I figured I would go ahead and include it because it is a really fascinating book from a late 19th century, early 20th century landscape painter from Great Britain, Sir Alfred East. And it has some really lovely illustrations, and it has some really interesting ideas within this book that were not so common. Different advice on painting sky, different advice on painting grass, trees, clouds, composition. Two of the really interesting bits in here is how do you paint your sky when you're not using titanium white. Back in the day they had lead, and he talked about how you would have to start with a gradient of just wet white, kind of like Bob Ross would do, and then start working in ultramarine from the top, yellow ochre from the bottom, and that really works as a sky gradient, and that looks like what a lot of people in the Hudson River School might have been doing to me when I look at those colors. Other things, our sky is ever changing, but our ground is not when we are painting outside. So always design your sky to complement the composition of the ground. You know, if the clouds are going to be moving, you could choose where those clouds are going to be moving. And there's some other interesting bits of composition, some bits about painting water, some bits about painting trees. There is a free PDF online, and it's a pretty short read because it looks like a really big book, but that's just because the words were printed really big. Next tiny little book, I picked this tiny book up very recently. This is probably my latest addition within this stack of books because I found this book online. I found the PDF of it on Internet Archive. And I should say that Internet Archive is a really great resource for finding PDFs of art books. A lot of them are past copyright and uploaded there as PDFs. And so you can go and read this there. It might also be hard to find. But this book was phenomenal for learning about trees and a really accessible way to learn about trees and a way how to actually study them. You study trees first by their leaves, and then by their stem, and then by their branch, and then by the full tree. And it was a great help in starting to learn about trees myself. I've been trying to learn about trees this past year, learning the difference about maples and oaks and beeches and birches and all these types of things, because when you put a name to something, you're able to see it, you're able to know it, you're able to then categorize these different things and identify them and reproduce and recreate it within our painting. So really interesting idea on there that kind of comes from this book and some other experiences I've had. Now, I'll include that book as almost a precursor to this, Rex Vickett Cole's The Artistic Anatomy of Trees. If you really want to take a deep dive on learning about trees and learning how to draw them, learning how to paint them, this is one of the best books out there, but it's really dense. Very scientific, almost botanical knowledge about how plants actually grow, how things actually shoot, the patterns of different growths. And so it's very fascinating, but very heavy. Now, there are two art books I have that are recent. One of them is James Gurney's Color and Light. Now, this book came out within the last 20 years, most recently published one in terms of art instruction that I think is fantastic. He illustrated his own books, and he also had a blog about drawing, painting, illustration, a number of things, where he did a lot of research and he shared something interesting every single day. And this book kind of comes from that blog, from the posts about his research into light and color and effects of optics. And so this book's really great because it gives you just a whole lot of examples about different types of effects of painting, painting in the night, painting form, painting value, different types of lighting, different types of value, different type of color. One of my favorite things is it has a lot of pictures, so it's really easy to pick up, it's really easy to skim through, it's really easy to learn. You'll figure out something new about color that you didn't before, probably, if you pick this book up. So credit to him. I've also gone back on his blog because it's one of the best out there, and I would read every single post that was tagged academic art or composition or optics or color or light. And there's a lot of fantastic stuff out there from James Gurney, so worth reading. This is a slightly older book, but again, like the Pattern from the Tree books, this is really worth picking up to get a really in-depth understanding about color and light, about specific effects within the atmosphere, why certain things happen, why the sky is blue, what is Riley scattering, what is me scattering. Bit of a thicker read, not very many diagrams, but you can sort of skip through it and pay attention to what is actually relevant to painters and what is not, because I don't think this book was actually written for painters, but it was just written for people to learn a little bit more about what we're seeing in the world. Funny enough, he does cite, and the interesting thing about landscape painting specifically, as it relates to maybe, portraiture, maybe still life, any type of painting, we're practicing observation. Ideally, what we're doing when we're painting is we're expanding our ability of perception, and we're seeing the world in a slightly new way. So this is really true for when we're out painting landscapes. When I've had students of mine in workshops, I've pointed out, pay attention to the color of the sky on the horizon. Compare that to the darkest darker, the lightest light of something within our own field next to us. And then take your eyes slowly up and notice the gradient of value and color. A lot of times when we're painting, we recognize things that we may have never noticed before. Things like the sky isn't actually blue at the horizon. And it's a really fun, it's a really cool thing. I've had a really few funny moments of people getting their mind blown in classes, and I've had that experience myself. Now, I actually have 4 books left, so bear with me. One last art book, and then 3 very important books that are a bit more psychological. So the last art book, I went back and forth of whether or not I should include it, but I think I will, and that is Richard Schmidt's Alla Prima. This book you've probably came across on YouTube before. It's one of the best books written in the last 30, 40 years. I forget when exactly the first edition came out. This is Alla Prima 2, so it's the second edition, expanded. And this book is really great, slow read. So it has a bunch of practical advice mixed with a lot of really inspirational stuff. Richard Schmidt's writing, his style, it will really inspire you to go out and see the beauty in the world and capture some of the things. But he actually offers a lot of really great technical insight too. So different approaches to starting a painting, such as blocking in, a monochrome block in. So he has examples of how his paintings would look like through that. The importance of, drawing from life. He has a really great thing about color charts. He has a great thing about warm and cool light, how to deal with that, dealing with overcast light, problem solving. It's really a great book throughout, and it's a little bit of a longer read, but it's got a bunch of great stuff in here, so I'd recommend that. Like I said at the beginning of this video, practice does not always make perfect. Knowledge and practice makes perfect. When you're able to get these new ideas, these new mental models of how we actually think about the world and change the way that you're actually thinking while you're working, that's how we get better. We shift from working very naively when we're drawing and painting, so drawing in symbols, to then in our process of a single painting or in our larger art journey, we start learning all these very analytical ways about measuring and seeing what it is that we're looking at. So when we take our plumb line or take our skewer or whatever and start measuring heights and widths and analyzing color, the way that what's the darkest, what's the second darkest, we're going in a very analytical way about measuring it, what it is that we're seeing. And that helps us a whole lot from drawing spaghetti hair or unrealistic, just broccoli looking trees when we're kids. And that helps us push towards painting something real and painting something truthful and really capturing something that we see that's beautiful. And then past that, we start thinking and using our mind in other ways to be a bit more intuitive. So we start feeling what is out there in the scene, and we start trying to observe our feeling, recreate that in the painting. But then there are a few psychological things about actually painting. And so these are 3 books that I've had since my days as a student. So one of them is Flow by Mikhail. It's a really long Hungarian name. I don't think I can pronounce that. The Inner Game of Tennis. Got this when I was 19 from an early teacher. And then The War of Art by Steven Pressfield. These books talk about some of the importances of learning and staying on track. So Flow talks about getting into a flow state, that the ideal when we are performing in any skill is being ever so slightly challenged, just enough where we can handle it, but it's new and it's stimulating. And that is when we slip into a place where just time flies by, we forget about the world around us, and we're really in the zone. So how does that relate to drawing and painting? Well, if we're doing something that's too easy, we're not going to be challenged at all, and we're going to be bored. But if we're doing something that is too difficult, then we're going to be overwhelmed, and we're not going to be in the zone, and we're not going to perform at our best either. So ideally, we set our own challenge to our own goals. And we could do this by breaking up our process. We could do this by deciding what it is that we're focusing on. I often try to decide and figure out single parts of a painting or work around a painting. And whenever I'm feeling really bad, I will limit the scope of what it is that I'm doing so I could focus on something manageable and try to get back into that flow stage. Another thing that sort of relates to that flow stage, the inner game of tennis, well, that relates to the little voices inside our head whenever we're practicing any skill, those little voices that are telling us that, oh, like we're not good enough, like you suck. In tennis, according to this book, you have 2 opponents. You have the person on the other side of the court, but then you also have the little voices in the back of your mind, the little monkey voices, the little monkey brain that we need to quiet. When it comes to drawing and painting, we don't really have an opponent on the other side of the court, but man, do most of us probably have those voices in the back of our head where like, oh, you're messing up, this is bad, this is bad. It's critical to learn to handle those voices, to not listen to them. Sometimes meditation can really help, just keep you calm, things like box breathing, but understanding that part of the process in a skill, it's natural that you're going to have these voices of self-doubt, and you just can't listen to them when you're actually doing the thing. Now, the last book that I think would be a nice way to summarize this, The War of Art. It's really been a while since I've read this, but basically, you just gotta do the thing. If you want to get better, you gotta set the time and you gotta get to it. The real war of art is procrastination and excuses of not actually going out and doing it. So that was a really inspirational book for me to read on that. The last little bit of advice that I've received from somewhere long ago is that art, a creative practice, a creative journey, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. You want to go as far as you can at the pace you can. You don't want to burn yourself out and come crashing down and die. Birge Harrison, however, says that may be a great thing. Maybe that may be some temperament, and then you'll have those lows and then you'll have those highs. It's important to, have a healthy relationship with what you do, but most of all, enjoy what it is that you're doing. I think painting should be fun. I think the best part about painting, about being an artist, is being able to see the beautiful world out there. And the really great thing about being an artist is as we get better, we get to see beauty that we didn't appreciate before. So, hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll have a list for all these books below, and there's also going to be a link to if you guys want to take in-person classes, in-person workshops, Patreon, that good stuff, whatever. So, thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.